This is the Permission to Write podcast, and I'm your host, Ashley M. Coleman, author of Good Morning Love. Join us each week as writers discuss more than writing. You'll hear from me as well as the occasional guest on craft, publishing, life, and culture. We hope you enjoy the show. Hey everyone, it is another week in books, and I'm thrilled to be joined by my two esteemed guests this time around. I'm like really up in the ante here with some of the people who want to sit and chat with me. But today I am chatting with the author of Sweet, Soft, Plenty Rhythm, Laura Warrell. Her book was a Pim Faulkner Award finalist in fiction. She has taught at a myriad of institutions throughout Los Angeles and Boston, as well as workshops. Her writing has been featured in the New York Times, LA Times, Lit Hub, and many other publications. And overall, she is just a dope human being. So I am very thrilled to have her here. And also joining me is the author of My Government Means to Kill Me, Rasheed Newson, named a Lambda Literary Award finalist in gay fiction in 2022. And a New York Times notable book. Also a television professional with a start in TV writing on shows like The Chi and Lie to Me, and serving as an executive producer on Bel Air. He is a husband and father of two. So a ton more accolades that we could go on and share, but we don't have time to talk about how amazing they are. But we do have a wonderful topic prepared for you all. So thanks so much for joining me, to both of you. So
thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
No worries. And feel free. It's like, it's conversational.
Cash.
We were having a kiki about the stigma of romance, in one of our last episodes. But the great thing about, I think, having this discussion, around writing sex is that everyone has a bit of a different lens, right? Like of which they're approaching the work. So can you talk about the decision overall to include sex scenes in your work? Because I feel like sometimes there's this question posed of like, do we even need it? I think that even happens in film sometimes, right? Where you're like, did we need the sex scenes? So can you talk a little bit about the decision to include them in your work and how you kind of come to that idea of inserting it into the larger picture, the larger story?
Oh, okay.
I'm going to defer to you, Laura.
There's so many ways to answer that. The first is that from sort of looking at it through a cultural lens, as you both know, because we're buddies, I listen to a lot of podcasts about popular culture. And there's a lot of talk now about a resistance to seeing sex, particularly in film and television, right? That we don't need it, we don't want it, it makes us uncomfortable, which I'm curious about. I'll just say it that way. But one reason that I like to see sex in a book or a movie or a television show is because, to me, it helps understand the character. It helps understand the relationships. And so when I write, I include sex when I feel like this is important for the reader to experience with the character, right? In the first book, Sweet, Soft, Plenty Rhythm, which you talked about, there aren't actually a lot of sex scenes, which could bring us down another road. And Rasheed and I have actually talked about this. I think when you're a white man and you write about sex and you're considered a literary icon, or just star, that's part of your literary cachet, right? That's part of what makes you special. But when you are not a white, straight, cis, etc. man, then there's a little bit more suspicion, it feels like, about how seriously your work should be taken, right? If you've got a lot of sex in it. And so in my first book, I was really conscious of that. But in the second book, there are two characters there's a love triangle. And you as the reader need to know how the sex is with that, sort of point of the triangle for these other two characters, because it's going to inform how they feel in the relationship, how they feel about themselves, what they like about it, what's lacking. And so right now, that's where I am, but there's a lot more to say. So, Rasheed, turning it over to you.
Look, I'm a gay black man, so I typically am writing, sex between two men. And I feel I have to. I get really worked up about this. I think that, that's the heart of the bigotry, right? That the sex we have as homosexuals makes heterosexuals uncomfortable. And to not present that as part of our lives and as part of the story is to sort of cop out. And it lets heterosexual readers off the hook. Oh, good. I don't have to deal with any of that nasty sodomy that I don't like to think about, which is really fueling a lot of the hate. I'm going to name a few names here in terms of just movies and projects. The movies I'm going to talk about are Brokeback Mountain and Moonlight. Brokeback Mountain, in large part, did not win Best Picture, I feel, because we saw those two cowboys have sex in a tent. And there was a segment of the audience that was repulsed. And so then Moonlight came along a few years later, and nobody was more excited to see Moonlight than me. And no one was more disappointed to leave that theater than me. Because I thought Moonlight was like about gay Black love and sex, and we were going to get that. And all I got was a hand job on the beach, right? Like they just pointedly sort of ignored that. And the gambit paid off. They won Best Picture because somehow they told a gay Black story, but didn't get into the messy bits of it, right? And that rang so inauthentic to me. And that absolutely fueled me. So my story, My Government Means to Kill Me, a lot of it takes place in a bathhouse. Mm-hmm. We have to talk about sex. It's not a knitting circle. This is what they're doing there. And so I thought I had to get into it. So I get that sometimes if you're writing to a certain genre, a certain audience, you don't want to include it. But if this is adult literature, then let's be adults. And that's going to include a discussion on sex.
Oh, I love that. And it's so true. Because I guess even when I'm thinking about it to myself, like, of course, like my book got pushed under romance, right? But it was really a women's fiction book from the start, which I've kind of talked about. That I was not pitching a romance because it didn't have a lot of sex in it. And so I think you're absolutely right, though. And Laura kind of touched on this as well. Like if we're following these characters, and specifically if we're following characters, whether in a bathhouse or whether they're falling in love, as adults, there's going to be sex at some point. How do you kind of omit these things from the story? I think it kind of serves a certain inauthenticity, right? If we don't kind of include them. But I think that we can have various different ways that we approach them. And so I remember Gina Prince Bythewood, who's one of my low-key favorite directors. I feel like you either know or you don't know. But I remember a while back her discussing her approach to sex scenes. She's done films like Love and Basketball and Beyond the Lights. And she talked about how she focuses on some of the areas beyond the obvious. So for instance, in Beyond the Lights, there's a sex scene on a plane and they're zoomed in on the hands, gripping the sides of the seats and or Love and Basketball, we kind of really zone in on like Sanaa Lathan's face and everything that's happening as her and Omar Epps are having this exchange right in the film. And so for me, that's been a bit of a guiding principle of how I feel like I personally show up to sex scenes on the page. I feel like Rasheed kind of touched upon it, but would there be more that you would both say about any guiding principles about how you approach writing sex scenes in your own work?
One thing that I am thinking about too is that sex is actually can be, it's not always presented this way, really beautiful and nice to watch in a movie. Not like I'm spying on my neighbors, but
hey, that's a thing. We don't kink shame.
I don't do that, neighbors. But a really nice sex scene, a really beautifully written sex scene, a really beautifully photographed sex scene is aesthetically pleasing, just like, any kind of emotional or physical experience that we watch and get excited about. I don't know what it is. I think it's very American to have such discomfort with sex. And I feel like very often I watch films from other parts of the world and even television from other parts of the world, and there's just not that kind of hang up. So that's one thing that I wanted to put out there, because I think we often have discussions about, like, is it gratuitous? Is it necessary? And I think that is part of the discussion. But I think when you're watching a television show or movie or reading a book, you're having an aesthetic experience. You're trying to have an experience that is touching every part of your being as a human being, and sensuality and sexuality is part of that. So I've seen, films that have sex scenes in it and feel like they didn't really need that, but I'm glad they included it. It was nice. So that's one piece that I kind of wanted to throw out there. But as far as writing sex, I think it's really hard. It is hard to do it well because it can seem cheesy. It can seem over the top. There are ways to describe things that aren't very erotic and maybe a little bit more gross. You know what I mean? And people have different views of what that would look like. And so, I struggle with it. And I know Ashley knows this because I was talking about it recently. I have a very kind of long, important sex scene in the book that I'm working on now. And I know that, I need to revise some parts of it because it's going to sound, I don't even want to use the wrong words. It just doesn't sound erotic. It sounds clinical, or it sounds whatever. So I think, I have to think about it more, but how to actually do it in a way where it's pleasurable to read, but also says what it needs to say about your characters, your story, or where you are in the plot. I'm going to think more about it and maybe come back to specific tools, or maybe Rasheed will say something that will.
Well, no, I mean, both in my book and in television, we have to talk about sex and what are we doing here? And the feeling is always that sex has to reveal something, right? And or I like to joke in the writer's room. When you're writing something, your character never just eats ice cream. You tell us what flavor of ice cream. And that flavor tells us something about this person's taste. So it can't just be sex. It can't just be up, down, in, out. It's tell me what the story of this sex is. Are they on the same page? Are they connected? Is this an emotional connection? Is this somebody somewhere else? I mean, I've always... That's so silly. I've always sort of loved those moments in sex scenes where you can tell somebody's thinking about someone else just to get themselves across the finish line.
Right.
Tell me that. Give me that. Again, when it comes to gay sex, especially because I tend to do period pieces, so things like in the 80s, sex isn't just sex. Sex is a health risk. Sex is illegal. Sex is subversive. Sex is revolutionary. And I want to bring all of that to bear when I'm writing it. I tend to favor what I will call pleasurable sex. I feel like, you do. I mean, I'm not so keen to read bad sex, like when it goes wrong. I mean, unless you can make that funny, and then maybe I'm there for it. But I tend to think I'm sex positive, and I tend to think of sex as a healthy, wonderful, fulfilling thing, and I want to present it that way.
Can I add to that? Because you that was a perfect answer. That should be in the essay or the craft talk about writing about sex.
That was so good.
Because I think what actually happens a lot, and maybe this is what I was trying to say, is that we focus so much on what's happening, right? Where every body part is, what is happening sexually. And that's exactly the choreography, which can be important, but it's also, what is that person thinking about? What is that person feeling? Are they enjoying it? Are they not? What else is happening mentally, emotionally, in the room that will help shape our understanding of the story and the characters?
Well, I mean, not that we're giving out sex advice, but I mean, as on the page and in life, the moment you can have sex with somebody and they unlock something in you didn't know was even there, you didn't know that part of you was sensitive, you didn't know you'd like that thing, that is that is, oh, happy day, big discovery. And I always sort of like to drop that in, the idea that, okay, these are two people coming at it. What new thing can happen tonight?
I felt that in your book, too, because... when you talk about revealing things, it's like so much is happening, right? Because to your point, we're in the bathhouse, we're in New York City, it's popping, it's on, everybody's hot. And so there felt like there were all these moments that kind of revealed a new thing about the character and what was kind of happening surrounding him, and even just some crazy moments that he escaped, even without giving too much away, but like some of the dangerous people as well.
Well, what are our boundaries? I mean, like, you think so much about your character in relationship to their family, in relationship to their job, right? Who is this person as a sexual being? And it's okay if it's different than the librarian we see. I hope it's different than the librarian we see, at work. What does this person suddenly become when they are free and able to sort of express themselves in this zone? What are their needs? What are they looking for here? So,
and one of the things that I found in the first book that I wrote and the one that I'm working on now is the relationship when you are a hetero woman having sex with a dude, the politics of that. And not that I'm writing about the politics, absolutely not. But underlying those sex scenes, there is a dynamic, right? There is an expectation, especially as a woman, you're inhabiting your body in a different way when you're actually having sex with a man, right, than you might on your own, or if you didn't have this whole sort of cultural model of how you're supposed to be a sexual being and how you're supposed to engage with men, particularly because you're being seen through his gaze, right? Very often, at least in my generation, I know it's changing in generations behind me, we're sort of raised to think of our sexuality as something that we offer men, as something that we design for men. And I'm really interested when it comes to writing about sex in what do women really like? What do their bodies really desire? What's happening to them when they're having sex with a man that they like or that they don't like? Or how do they deal with those moments? And one of the women in the book that I'm working on now is a wife who's not sexually satisfied. But I don't want her to just be cold and frigid, which is bullshit, right? That we learn about women's sexuality. The issue she's having is I'm having sex in a way that I've learned to have sex or been told to have sex that is not working for me. And part of her story is going to be finding her sexuality in a way that is as rooted in her genuine desires as possible.
Well, but you mentioned something in this. I think it's interesting because every group, no matter what group you're in, there are these unique pressures to sexual performance, right? If you're the heterosexual man, you've got to be ready to go. I don't care what time it is. Your soldier needs to stand at attention. And it becomes a disaster. Like people they think they can't have sex if there's not an erect penis. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. All right. So, and then women, heterosexual women, I imagine, I hope this is changing, that there's this idea of like, I need to be good, but not too good. If I'm too good, that says something else. Where'd you learn that? Becomes like this indictment. Yeah. And then with gay men, this idea of like, we're up against the history of porn. You think I can do everything you saw in the video? You think I have the capabilities of all your fantasies because we're supposed to be, like hypersexual and capable of anything. And all of those things are in play and in negotiation while you're trying to have a good time.
Yeah, that's something that I try to explore within Good Morning Love, in that he's this hot R&B star who at that moment is having all this insecurity, right? Because it's different now. It's not just a random woman in a random city. It's actually somebody he cares for, and having that kind of, like you talked about, pressure, one, to perform because you sing a bunch of songs about how great you are in bed. And then also like, what does it mean when you actually have feeling for the person, in that moment too? So I love these things that we kind of get to challenge. And sometimes, I don't think that I was prolific enough to be thinking that in the moment. But, once you get it on the page, you're like, oh, wow, that was really saying something bigger, kind of speaking to this bigger point about, to your point, how we show up, how we perform. And like, it shouldn't actually be a performance, maybe. I don't know. Like maybe, or maybe so. I don't know. I don't want to be in anybody else's bed, but I like the idea of kind of like freeing ourselves from trying to perform in that space.
Well, so Ashley and I were at an event. I'm going to be very general in speaking about it, where there was a conversation about writing about sex, and people, again, I'm trying to be really vague. People we're talking about the power dynamic in sex. And I think there can be a power dynamic. The people that I was talking to were saying that there's always a power dynamic. And I feel like, yes, that's interesting and that's interesting to explore. And sometimes that happens. But to me, this is going back to what you're saying, Ashley. When you have a genuine connection where you're just like, this is working, we are into this, this is good. We can let the performance, we can let everything go and just kind of sort of enjoy this moment. But I think one of the things that we've already sort of hit on is how many aspects of story and character and humanity come through sex. It's not just pleasure. It's not just erotic. It's politics. Mm-hmm. It's gender dynamics. It's cultural expectations. It's personal anxieties and desire to perform. And how are you learning to perform? It's racially tinged as a Black woman. The sexual expectations that I have faced that white women have not, or other women have not. That's something worth writing about, and thinking about. So there's a lot there. It's very rich.
I mean, what's interesting, I think, and again, I hope this is changing. You go into sex with a partner or partners, and there really hasn't been any discussion typically about what are the expectations here. Am I your Black man fantasy? I mean, what do you want from, what do you think I have, and what are you expecting to see when we get naked? And then there's also sort of like with in gay relationships, a lot of times, I mean, again, I hope this is changing, but you'd go home from the club or go back with somebody and you hadn't even talked about positioning. So you get back and you're like, well, maybe this isn't compatible, or maybe we're not. Oh, I thought you were going to, you don't want to. I mean, it's very tricky. And so it involves improv, and it involves a negotiation, not just with the other person, but with yourself. You're like, well, I've come all this way. What am I going to do? What can I do? How far can I go tonight? And all of that is saying something about you in the moment.
It makes me think about how, there's so much conversation around, like, there's always discourse about representation in writing sex. So writing characters that aren't maybe always in peak shape, which I feel like is relevant, whether we're talking about heterosexual relationships, homosexual relationships, like, there's always like the fine built person on the other side. So talking about like what real bodies are, or maybe, we talked about even like sexual encounters that aren't always great, right? Which I feel like we have both sides. Rasheed saying, I'm mostly sex positive. Laura saying this woman can't figure it out, with her partner. So for you, when it comes to like your work, are you just being honest about your world and your characters, which leads to that kind of representation? Or is it something that you're actually thinking about when you're planning, when you're kind of going into a book of like what the array of characters are going to be like in relation to sex and how they're showing up? So, and for a little bit more context, like specifically another writer friend of mine, she's a larger woman, so she writes larger characters. And that is a very conscious decision. Versus, for instance, for me, I wrote an Afro-Latina character for no good reason. And people were like, so tell us about your background, and I was like, well, there were a few years that I hung out with a lot of Spanish people, but other than that, that's it. So is that something that you're consciously bringing to the work, or just kind of it reveals itself with the characters that you're writing about?
I tend to, what I tend to try to represent are people who are coming into their own and learning about who they are and discovering themselves as sexual beings. So I'm typically kind of interested in people who probably growing up didn't get a lot of attention or positive attention, and now they've come to the party and they realize I could be someone here. I'm a little less interested in sort of what I'll call the sex god who doesn't have to work for it and just is brilliant and wonderful. I can think of two cases where I've had that kind of character walk in, but then what I always want to kind of show is if I feel like if anything comes too easily, you're almost bored with it. Like they're not terribly, like it sounds like great being a sex god, but it's like, after a while, it's sort of like, it's this, that, and the other thing. I'm more interested in insecurities. I'm more interested in people who can't quite see their value at the beginning of the book and what kind of gets them to open their eyes.
How about for you, Laura?
I think there's a lot of similarity. I consider myself sex positive too. I really like sex. I really like reading about sex. I like watching sex. And I feel like I build characters, and by the time I even am contemplating their sexuality, like I don't think of sexuality as something I have to decide, like I have to decide their job or whatever else. It's something that emerges from their character. And what I do find, sort of linked to what Rasheed was saying, in my own life experience, and I'm working on a lecture for this program where I teach about this, which is your struggle, how the challenges in your own life inform your work. And my sexual life informs my work, because in some ways I do feel like, as a woman who has sex with men, I have had to, my own sexuality has evolved. The performance that I gave in my 20s, I no longer do. You know what I mean? Like we're both here, right? Yeah.
You retired that show.
I've retired that show. You've retired that show. Yeah. But I also feel like, as a Black woman, and I think this is true for a lot of women of color, we are all struggling within the mythologies that are built around our sexuality. And people are bringing that into the bed with us. And even though I don't name it, that's just a personal choice for me as a writer, it's something that I am exploring. And so in my first book, there are lots of women who were being chosen by this male character who's a player because of his sexual desires. And once they recognized that, they had to decide, how do I feel about how I'm being seen? How do I feel about how I'm being treated? What does this mean about my sexuality? And there's one woman in particular who is very sexual. She's sort of the bimbo character, and that in quotes. And I wanted her, because that character in every culture is treated so poorly and easily discarded. I wanted her to have a moment where she says, wait a minute, I actually like my body. I like sex. I like who I am. And I'm not going to internalize this, absurd, misogynistic way that I'm being seen by the men I'm involved with. And hopefully that comes across very subtly in that book, but that was my intention. In this next book, even though this woman, as I said, one of the characters is not in touch with her sexuality, because she is very beautiful. I see her as very voluptuous and larger. And I want her to go inside, right? This isn't working as well with her husband, but it's because of her sexuality. And I don't want to give too much away, but I want her in the journey through this story to realize this is what I want. And it's not working, not because of me. It's not working because of this dynamic and because of him. And that's a journey I think I want women to go on in their own lives.
You made me think of something, and I'm sorry to use the performance analogy, because it's like, yes, we should probably, let's just be authentic. But I do sometimes wish people knew, and my characters something I want to show them is, sometimes you're in front of the wrong audience. That this hometown crowd may not like you, but things would change if you just moved somewhere else. So one of the great gifts of my life, which was an accident, is when I graduated high school in Indiana, where this was not, they weren't lining up for this. I moved to DC, where we sold out every night. Everybody, the lines around the block in DC. Chocolate City. I am in college. I'm on my little bike through DuPont Circle. I'm getting catcalled and attention. And again, that can sound like, oh, vain or you can dismiss it. But it was very helpful when I moved to LA after college. And that was a very different scene. And sort of they liked white skinny boys with blonde frosted tips. And suddenly people weren't looking at me. I knew that it wasn't me. I had the DC experience to go, no, wait a minute. Attractive, intelligent, smart people fall for me. I don't know what your problem is here in LA. I need to go find people I need to find my crowd. And that's what positive reinforcement can do for you. That's what owning your sexuality can do for you. You're not always going to get great notices. You're not always going to have people want you back, but it doesn't wound you as deeply if you actually know, like, wait a minute.
That is so
well,
big.
I think, when Rasheed and I, it's ping-ponging back and forth with ideas, I think it's also true that we have a very surface level understanding of sex and sexuality and sensuality. I've been in a lot of situations where, I'm at a club or something, or we're dancing, and all the guys, and these are, hetero environments, are watching this one woman. And I want to go, look at her body. Look at the way she's carrying herself. Look at the way she's dancing. That's going to be a good time. You know what I mean? But we have this very, like I said, surface level view of, and so many people can fit into it. I can wear the right clothes. I can say the right things. I can talk about how I have sex in this certain way. And I'm going to come across as a sexual, sexy person. But you can there's that performance on that level too.
And also, these are things to learn. I learned, in college, there was a club called Badlands. It was so loud, nobody could talk if you were just next to them. So It was purely on look. And I did all right there, but I did better in the fireplace because that was a bar where you could talk. And I'm funny. And I've got, I can win. And so somebody who might be like, oh, he's sort of cute, have a drink with me. And suddenly what's your number? They want to take me home. Whereas, And I learned, I was like, wait a minute, I don't want to be in the big loud rave where I can't bring to bear everything I've kind of got going for me. I want to be in the clubs where I can show you the full spectrum. My thing was I need 20 minutes to make you fall in love with me. Can't just
and you're touching on something that is connected again to writing, right? That it's not just the sex scene. It's not just when those characters are in bed, right? What are they saying to each other that is creating that sexual energy between them? And I don't just mean seduction. I mean intellectually and emotionally. And what are they doing out in the world together that is also shaping not only how they have sex together, but that is a part of their sexual relationship. It's not just, and maybe that's an interesting way to look at it too, is that you're writing a sexual relationship. You're not just writing sex scenes. And everything that those characters do together is a part of their sexuality and their sexual dynamic.
You all are putting so much, it's like my brain is going overtime because I'm almost like, it's so interesting to even think about that story, right? Of the positioning, like someone just being in the wrong positioning, I feel like that's kind of rich for the mind somewhere to put in a story. But it's so true because I remember I exist when I go to the East Coast. Thankfully I'm married. I don't care, but I feel like I'm invisible in LA. And then all of a sudden I go to the East Coast and I'm like telling my mom, I'm like, why is everyone so nice to me? And she's like, 'cause you're gorgeous. And I'm just like, I know, I'm like, LA is a completely different structure, but go ahead, Rasheed.
Yeah.
No, I had a friend, a heterosexual female friend who was struggling dating in Indianapolis. And then she just moved to Chicago. I mean, this is not far. She just moved to Chicago.
Yeah.
And the men ate her up. And it was something as simple as, I think, they weren't afraid. She's very smart. She's very successful. They weren't intimidated. And in Indianapolis, my thing to her was like, you're around too many of these guys who you went to high school with and they they can't see you differently. Go somewhere else. You will be a big deal. And it was amazing. I mean, from Indianapolis to Chicago, I'm not talking about the other side of the world. And suddenly they can value you in a way that you're just not getting where you are.
And Laura talked about, just which is so important, everything that goes around the sexual encounter. which is sometimes the hardest part. I am like jumping all over the place in a story that I'm working on, which is very fun because I'm normally a very linear writer, but in this new story, I've just been writing whatever I feel like writing that day. But some of the struggle is trying to figure, well, how do they get here? You know, like, oh, they love each other, but like, what are the steps, right? Like, how do they get to the point where they love each other? And I think that's what you're both talking about, the surrounding and, you know, is it that they just saw them or is it that they had the 20-minute conversation that was amazing? What are all these kind of things that represent that moment and getting them to that moment? Is so rich, sometimes really hard, though, to execute. I can say firsthand.
Yeah. Also, like big and small. I love that there's talk of love and connection, but there's also just, you know, I remember once you're with somebody and he's gorgeous and he's great and this is happening and you smell him like this cologne is so rank. And suddenly you're like, how can I move this into the shower before we continue? Or can I hold my breath? Can I hold my breath? I mean, the body, like the desire is there. And like somehow, like something like as small as you don't like the cologne they're wearing can become a major impediment.
Yeah.
So what's supposed to happen?
Real thing.
Yeah. I forget what I was going to say, and I don't know how personal we can get, but I was going to say something else. Hopefully it'll come back to me. But I do think I've had moments in my own sex life that I want to turn into a scene in a book, right? And I was remembering that, I don't know how personal I should get, but I was having an encounter and I was thinking about like, God, I feel so alone right now during the encounter. And I sort of teared up and he was like, I guess I'm
like thinking he was
really,
oh God.
Yeah, I'm really blowing her mind. And that's such a great moment, you know? And of course I'm a writer going, I'm so alone. Yeah. Hey, this is really working out. This will be a great scene in a story. But it is, right? Because you have this dynamic happening. You've got you've got a tear coming down a woman's face, which is a very evocative moment. Then you've got him thinking and saying, wow, you know, this is feeling, and what's happening in her mind is, God, I need to work something out in my life that I'm in this situation, right? So I think that that's part of it. And I think that, too, going back to that sexual relationship, I think it's harder. This is what I was going to say. I think it's harder to show two people building a connection, whether it's love or just desire, than it is anything else in a story. And I just watched a show that I won't name that's very successful right now. And there was a scene where the two characters meet and we're supposed to believe that they fall in love. And as a writer, it's just like, this dialogue. And you knew what it was supposed to be doing. They were supposed to be like poking fun at each other, but there's a little sexual tension under it. And I was like, this is so contrived. This does not sound natural. Those are really hard scenes to write, but they're incredibly important, right? Because part of that scene was for us to start feeling like, ooh, there's something going on between these two people and to feel excited about it. But it just rang so false. So I think that those scenes, those are part of the sex scenes. They're part of the love scenes, and they're just as hard to write. So how do you find that dialogue in those moments that sound like real people making a connection, but that aren't contrived? It's a challenge.
It is hard in what I'm trying to do currently. I'm like, what is happening here?
I mean, this is, you know, it's Pride Month, so I guess I can say this. I do feel a little bit of sympathy for heterosexual writers or people writing heterosexual sex because the canon's so large. We've had so much of it. It was exclusively kind of like all we got that, yeah, the variation of what's supposed to be going on here, like there is a little bit for, you know, at least from a literary standpoint, I don't have to reach too far to find the conflict or the danger and what's happening. The book I'm writing now, working on now, takes place in the 1950s. A black man in the 1950s trying to have gay sex it's fraught, you know? You know, I mean, he's got to not only deal with, I mean, the racism, which is more pronounced as well, right? Like just everything is happening there. And so all those encounters have a tension that I'm sure, like if it's just a straight boy and a straight girl meeting on the bus, you've got to do more to figure out, well, what's the problem? Like what's the new thing to talk about here?
Go ahead, Laura.
Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, Rasheed and I were in conversation a couple of months ago, and I brought this up, that a lot of that literature written by straight people is by, again, white dudes. And I brought up Philip Roth at the conversation that Rasheed and I had, because I recently reread Portnoy's Complaint, which is brilliant. But when you get to those sex scenes, they sound like 13-year-old boys. You know what I mean? Talking about boobs and talking about coming, and the way that they do it, it just sounds kind of ridiculous and eye-rolling. And it's from their perspective. And they think that they're blowing women's minds, and they're probably not. Because especially at the time that we're writing, women were, they did think of sex as like, I'm pleasing this man, and I must like this thing because this is what we've learned sex is. And so I think that even though there's, as far back as you can go, there's so much literature written about straight sex, it's always about them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's exciting when women,
like widening
write about having sex with men.
Right. Widening that scope.
How unsatisfying it can be, not because it's unsatisfying having sex with men. I think it does. Porn, for example, does straight men a horrible disservice, because it's like, I can't do that. That doesn't feel good. It might look cool, but it does not feel good. You know what I mean? And so I think that, more women writing about sex and writing graphically about sex and writing about what women like is a good thing.
Yeah, that autonomy for sure. I think specifically as women of color, I think is really important, because no one talks. Well, I'm sure in some households, but in a lot of households, no one talks to POC women about sex. You just kind of figure it out as you go. So there is that idea of a different perspective, at least in that way, which I think is helpful, especially if someone cracks open the books, to be like, you're not blowing people's minds every time you're doing this.
I mean, tell them. Give them we've come with the feedback.
Right? That's probably like, she's faking it. You're reading a book like, she is totally faking it.
Right. It's like textbook. Like, wait a minute, she does that. Oh man, like I've never pleased a woman in my life. But, tell me about avoiding getting mechanical. And so I want to talk about this, and then I'll have one other question. But I feel like there was specifically a lot of backlash when it came to the TV show Insecure, and how they weren't like showing that the characters were using condoms. That was like a big kind of internet fodder moment. And so I wanted to pose that about like, how do you manage that? Like, do we, is it artistic license? Because I think kind of Issa was like, it's assumed. And like, or like or maybe there was a rapper in the background or whatever, even if there wasn't like showing that was happening. But I know for me, like sometimes certain things get really mechanical when I'm like, they had to reach into the drawer, and then like it can kind of like mess up the flow of this quote unquote passion. So how do you avoid the pitfalls of like getting really mechanical? And is there this such thing as like artistic license to kind of skirt around certain things?
Well, okay. I will say, speaking of shows that when I first started watching Insecure and I saw the first sex scene, I was like, whoa, I can't believe this is happening. It's like, I guess it's HBO. Yeah, I loved the sex on that show. And I would be of the same mind as Issa, that like, it's assumed, right? I had no problem with that. And I grew up in the generation where we were all really freaked out about it. You know what I mean? Because I grew up in the generation where it started just as we were like, oh, I get to have sex now. It's like, well, yeah, but now this is what you have to deal with. So when I watch that show, or when I watch any show or any scene where sex is happening, I guess I just assume that people are being safe, unless I'm told that they're not. But I guess I also feel like it's not. I mean, when it's actually happening, it can be, you can incorporate condoms into it in a way that's sexy. But I mean, I don't. And in the first book I wrote, the first book I published, there was sex and nobody reached for a condom, but I did, sort of the Issa POV, like we can assume it. It's not as, I'm not including it. It's not as, I don't know. It just doesn't feel as sexy on the page. Right.
Yeah.
But, what do you say, Rasheed?
Well, we do this in television and on this, like, you'll say things like, this is not a documentary. This is not an assembly manual from IKEA. You should not be able to read this or watch this and be able to recreate it like a recipe that you watch on a cooking show. We're giving you the impressions and the sweep of something. But like, I don't, I get a little more leeway because I'm typically like, it was the 80s. So at one point I just announced, okay, he's going to start using condoms. And then I just moved on from there. But I think if you're getting bogged down in that, you've probably gone a little off the page. You've lost touch with what is supposed to be connecting with people. I'm always like, okay, they're having sex. You know what the general idea of that is. What's the news here? What's someone feeling? What's someone doing? What's someone doing that's new? All the other stuff is sort of just assumed and in play. And also, like, I think once you start getting very mechanical, you risk losing the reader because not all of us do. Like, suddenly they start thinking about the mechanics of that, and they're like, well, I wouldn't do that, or I wouldn't. Why is he leaving his socks on? Like, whatever that thing is that gets them out of the story, and you kind of want them in the emotions of the story. It is interesting what Laura's saying about like the tear and the crying, that the hottest stuff is what's going on inside their head.
That's so good.
Yeah, I guess that's a good way to put it, because it's not, it feels like, I may regret saying this, but it feels like if you were having a character smoke and making sure someone says, you really shouldn't be smoking. Smoking is bad for your health. X%, you know what I mean? It's like we know that characters, I don't know. I guess I feel like it's assumed that, I don't know, maybe I'm digging a hole for myself. I guess the way that I write is I feel like it is assumed that these characters are taking care of themselves. Yeah.
So it's also, I will throw this one little thing out there about all this, because I do get that it's generally assumed, but are we to pretend that in real life there are people having sex without condoms?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's amazing that like the characters in literature and television seem to be way more adamant or vigilant about this than the real people in life. And people get really up in arms about, I didn't see this character do blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, but wait a minute. So you're saying you never got caught up and
I think that's what I loved in You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty. There's a very I'm like, I don't know, the word that was coming to me was like raunchy, but I'm like, I don't know if I want to put that judgment on it, but there was like, an intense scene that kind of starts that book and you're like, what is happening? But it really is that. It is in the moment. It is happening. It is with a stranger and it is unprotected. And the whole time you're like,
but did she make a point of it? Does she make a point to the reader so the reader knows, or does she just not mention?
No, she mentions it. So yes, this is a part of what is happening, because it's like, yes, the first part that is happening is that it's unprotected. The second part that's happening is that this person finishes, right? So that is in the story of what is actually happening. And, so I think it feeds into because I think when you first kind of jump into it, you're kind of like, who is this person? Because this is probably not the norm per se for everybody. I don't know. You know what I mean? But there are some people who may do that. But I think for most of us within the context of the story, you're thinking, okay, what's going on with this character that just allowed this thing to happen, right? So to Rasheed's point, it's a bigger story. It's the news, right? It's giving us news about this character. And then to your point, Laura, it's like, she's, the character is doing it in a way that is revealing something more, in the story.
I actually know a lot of people. I have a lot of friends who do not use condoms. And like I said, I'm of the generation where it's like, you know what I mean? But now that I'm thinking about it, in my first book, no, there is no actual intercourse. And then in the book that is happening now, they're married and there is going to be a discussion. It's like I said, it's a love triangle, and there is going to be a discussion. Like, are you using protection with this other person? Did you use protection with this other person? So now that I'm thinking about it, yeah, it's coming up because it's important, again, to the dynamics of the story and the evolution of the story. And maybe that's what I just keep coming back to. In a sex scene between two characters, what you need to know right now is how they're having sex, what's happening for them emotionally, what's happening for them mentally. You don't necessarily need to know right now in this situation whether they're protecting themselves. It's not important whether they're using condoms, right? It may not be important for this scene and this part of their story. Whereas over here, you need to know about condom use because it's important to the story. And then otherwise, like I said, making an assumption that people are protecting themselves, or maybe making an assumption based on your understanding as the reader of that character, whether or not they are.
Yeah. Yeah. So to wrap it up on this portion of things, not that there's a hard way, but I guess in your opinion, do you feel like there's a right and a wrong way to write sex?
I mean, yeah, part of it goes, do people enjoy reading your sex? I mean, that's, it's almost like, is there a right or wrong way to performing sex? Well, if all the feedback is negative, maybe you should look at what you're doing. And so I feel that way about the writing. Are people attracted to this, or does everyone flip those pages? This goes to what Laura's saying. I think what was happening before, when you think of like the Philip Roth of it all, is it was like, look at me, mom, riding a bike with no hands, right? It's like, can you believe this? She took her breasts out and they were really big. And we now we demand a bit more from these encounters. And so I think if you are giving us something true, something that rings through, like, oh yeah. I mean, you at one point in the thing, you want the audience to either say, I've been there, or I wish I was there. Like, give me, like, one of those should go off in the reader's mind. And if neither of that is happening, if they don't want it, and they're not there, and they don't recognize it as something they've ever experienced, you've probably done it wrong.
I agree. And I think that good sex writing is like good sex, that you have an awareness of what's happening for everyone involved, right? And I think, again, part of what sort of makes me roll my eyes when I read the Philip Roths, and there are obviously contemporary versions, is they don't, when they're writing about straight relationships, they don't get women. They don't get sex for women, or they don't care about how that female character is experiencing it. And so even if there's, one of the people involved in that sexual encounter is not satisfied or not having a good time, having an awareness of what that means and what that feels like and what the thoughts are. And I think especially in hetero relationships, there's a lot less interest in men on what's happening. I mean, they just think, if I make her have an orgasm, I've achieved. I have to do something with my tongue or my fingers or
somewhere,
my other appendage. And if she has an orgasm, it was great. but they don't think about like all the other parts of that experience. They don't think about the emotional or mental parts of that experience for the women. And if that's what's happening on the page, it's really clear to a woman reading it, right? And so that to me is writing about sex poorly. It's not being aware of everything that's happening for all of those characters. Even if we're totally in the point of view of a white male jerk character, the writer needs to know what's happening for that woman.
Laura, what hit me is like, you talk about like they're not aware. Yeah. They're not even curious. Because there's a way that the straight male writer could write this and say, like, he can't maybe get to what is she thinking, but he should at least be like, why is she crying?
Yeah.
Right? Like, can you just get with, like, why is he not talking? Or did I do something wrong? Or, just be curious. Like, notice this person's having a reaction. You don't have to have all the answers as to why they feel that way, but just acknowledging that you notice there's another person in the room.
Or even just saying, instead of going, oh, I must be great in bed, that's why there's a tear in your eye, saying, hey, why is there a tear in your eye? You know,
like, are you enjoying this or no?
Think of the intimacy that could happen with that conversation. I feel like, you know, the number of times that and books are a little different because you know who's writing the book, but the number of times that I have watched a TV show or a film that, features a female who is having a relationship with a man, either sexually and romantically, the number of times that I have said, this was totally written by a man, and then checked my phone and it was, I would be paying off my student loans. You know, and so I think that that's part of it, is that, and this show that I'm thinking of was totally written and directed by a man or men. And I was like, they don't know women. This is just a fantasy of women's sexuality. This is a fantasy of women's interest in men. And they do a very good job of presenting it, but it's a fantasy. And if you really tried to understand women, not only would they be more satisfied in their sexual and romantic relationships, but so would you. You would be having better sex with a woman who's really into it. You know what I mean? And if you could see what you could do with her, you'd really be enjoying it. But there's so much tunnel vision on what they've learned and the very basic sort of instincts and pleasures they can have, that there's so much that we both miss out on in those relationships. And so that's what I mean about it's not as exciting on the page, is that lots of stuff is missing because there's such a narrow vision on what sexuality is, but in particular what it is for women.
Well, there you have it. I love it. I think that is so much to give to the audience, which is, you know, a lot of other writers in trying to really find their way in regard to how to approach these things, because it is such a major part of relationships and a lot of the things that we're writing. Along that same vein, we always like to share some additional writers that folks should check out. So we do that as a part of our segment called The Canon. So we want you to highlight a writer based on each of the criteria below that you would recommend to other people. And so the first one is a writer whose online or public persona that you love.
Does this have to do with sex or just in general?
In general.
Okay. An online presence.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not doing X or Twitter much anymore. Roxane Gay was somebody that I consistently followed and was always keeping up with, not only because I like her, you know, as a writer, but she's just generous, you know, she's promoting other writers and smart and funny about whatever's happening in the culture. So maybe I would say Roxane Gay for social media presence.
I would choose Brontes Purnell, poet and an author. In part because he can't help but be himself. He is irrepressible. and he is funny, and he's really smart. And sometimes he does these rambling stories at 2 a.m. when he's very high, and it's just funny and it's about nothing. But every once in a while, it's also sometimes political or it's really insightful. Like, he just has a great mind, and so whatever he wants to share,
I love that.
I'm
How about for
it.
writing voice? Who's a writer whose writing voice you love?
Well, I mean, I loved Rasheed's book. And, you know, we've talked about it. I just talked about it with my friend Daniel, who reviewed it for the New York Times. We were literally just talking about it 2 days ago. You know, you read so many books, and there are lots that are great. And I read Rasheed's book at a time where I was just sort of like enjoying everything I was reading in this very flat, not flat, but just like, yeah, this is good. This is good. Then I read Rasheed's book, and it was because of the voice that I felt alive. Like, I woke up. You know, I wasn't just reading a book. I was like, oh, wow. Because it's alive, and it's fresh, and it's new, and it's distinctive. I want to try to find a better word for it to really give it a descriptor. But I just felt like an individual human being was telling me a story in a way that was funny and was smart in a very unique way. And to me, that's something that we don't value as much as we should, that you really feel like I'm not just being told a story, I'm having an experience reading this. So, and Rasheed, I think every time I see Rasheed, I tell him how much I liked his book. But
oh my goodness, no, this is going to become a mutual appreciation club.
I didn't say that
because okay. It's worth doing, because I'm like, people are here and they've heard the accolades, but like what I thought of is, you get a book and I'm like, okay, this is about the women around a player, and you have your own sort of expectations about what that story is going to be and what those women are going to be like. And the book flips those expectations, but also, if you're really feeling it deeply, in a way that I think good literature should do, it indicts you into why did you hold on to that notion? You know, why did you walk in with those set of expectations? And I think that is actually the challenge of the book. I think it's the kind of book, I know a lot of readers, they just want to be coddled. From beginning to end, I don't want to have to think about myself as racist or homophobic or misogynistic. And yet, the power of all three of those horrible ideologies is they embed in each of us in some way, shape, and form. And you're only going to get it out by identifying where it lives. And so Laura's book does that. I mean, the number of times where I had to admit that I had written a certain type of woman off. You know, why does she keep getting back with this guy? Why doesn't she just leave? You know, you opening the door for her. My grandmother used to say, she opened the door and she opened her legs. You know?
Yeah.
And I heard that as a child, and I've never really, and I carried that with me. And so Laura's book was really good at making me stop and go, you think you know this story, but if you look at it through this lens, you know, what does it say about these people?
Well, I adored this love fest. That was perfect. A perfect love fest. So my last criteria for the canon is just command of language, which I feel like is a little bit different than voice, right? So voice is one aspect of writing, but whose language are you in love with? That's kind of how I feel about Akwaeke. When I've read them, I felt like, what is this language? And I felt like I needed to be better, which is part of my gaze of good literature. It's like, do I want to be a better writer after I read it? And Akwaeke Emezi is one of those people for me.
I think I have their book and I haven't read it yet, but I really want to. I had someone who I was going to say, Raven Lalani. One of the things that I really loved about Luster was the language. I'm into language. I'm into, a nice turn of phrase. I like to go, ooh, when I'm reading a sentence. And that happened a lot with Luster. So, and I know I'm not alone. That book was very well received. And to me, that was part of it. It was an interesting story, but also just, she's a really beautiful writer. And so that's who I would say.
In this way that probably it's I don't want to. It may sound like a cop out. I really do favor poets. So the two that come to mind, like Rita Dove, because like it is what you're saying. It's the economy of language, and I'm always sort of searching, and it's a new way to say something. The poem is I'm sad. Okay, well there are a million poems about being sad. What are you going to say today? So Rita Dove does that for me. Billy Collins does that for me. Billy Collins has a line in a poem that I just love. And it's I wonder how you're going to feel when you realize I wrote this instead of you. Which goes to that moment, like when you read a poem, you kind of embody it like you did it. And you're like, this is somebody else. And I love those two. That's where I try to steal from. Not that my writing is poetic, but real poetry. People think of poetry as flowery, and I actually think of poetry as stripping the varnish off of things. Like, let me just, I'm going to hit you with it straight.
I often crack open poems from Said Jones when I'm stuck of how to describe things or how to check things out. I always say the poets are the best of us. That is a recurring phase for me because I feel the same way. Love reading poetry. We barely publish them. It is sad.
We barely published them, and somebody told me, was like, oh, I got $5,000 for my poetry book.
Exactly. And I was like, but it used to be that they were heroes, just as much household names than novelists or any other types of writers. And now, most people couldn't name a poet if you paid them, which is unfortunate. I do the exact same thing. I have a whole section of poetry, and when I was like, I want to write a nice sentence, that's where I go. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, you all gave us a very robust list of authors and poets to check out. So that's why I love doing that segment. Cause yes, we want to talk about us and our work and our approach, but I also love being able to share who inspires the writers that inspire us. And so because there are many people who will be inspired by you, it helps to know who you're also looking to in moments of inspiration. So to wrap us up today, we want to do a lightning round on writing cliches. So this is a simple yay or nay. Okay. It's are you with it? Are you not? What is it? So the first one is write every day.
No.
Nays?
No.
Not that you shouldn't, but, it's not necessary.
But no.
You have to have a life.
You do. You have to have something to write about, right? Yeah.
Right.
I feel like I don't write the same thing every day, but I do think there's a lot of days I write. So if I don't work on something, I might journal. Or I don't know, there's a lot of writing involved. I feel like in our everyday lives that might not necessarily be our work in progress, but I'm with you. Write drunk, edit sober.
Sometimes.
No.
I've had some luck with it in the past.
I will say this comes from my TV. I mean, I probably don't even really drink during the television season because that phone could ring at any moment. They're like, we need you down here. It's like being on call at a hospital, except no one dies. So I just should point out that I want you to know I know the difference between working at a hospital and working in make-believe. But the similarity is you could be called on at any moment to have to explain something and having slurred speech would not be a good part.
You cannot draft and edit at the same time.
False. Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I think I'd do that. I mean, because don't you when I get back in, I start by reading what I wrote last time, and I can probably changing things there.
And I'm constantly, as I'm going forward, I'm constantly editing and revising. Yeah.
That's good. Show, don't tell.
Not always.
I mean, generally, yes.
Yeah, like it's better to, I agree, but sometimes I always try to show. And when I work with other writers and students, I always, show is so much better. But it's not always.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about kill your darlings?
Yeah. You got to. You put them somewhere else. Don't kill them. Put them somewhere else. Let them show up somewhere else.
Well, I fight pretty hard for my darlings. Because here's the thing. Like, it's tough, right? Like, is the darling what makes it me?
Does the darling help move your story forward?
Yeah, I think that the implication, right, is that the darling is unnecessary.
Well, sometimes the darling is really pretty language. Like, it's a great sentence, but.
I'll out myself in my book. I did something and it was a discussion because it's a cardinal rule. My book's taking place in the 80s. My main character has to deliver a letter to someone whose lovers just died of AIDS. And for that chapter, I gave the story over to the person receiving the letter. My character is essentially sitting there listening to this other person's story. I guess it could add to his growth, but there was this thing of like, what are we doing here? You've just parked your main character to have almost this short story inside your novel. And I would not come off it.
But I didn't mind it, so it didn't.
So maybe you should kill your darlings, but I'm probably guilty of just being like, I'm sorry.
I mean, I think we probably all had some of those fights. I definitely had this random scene that I was like, no, but I need this because you need to see how these two characters interact with each other. But I think after the book came out, I was definitely like, we could have got rid of that. But I fought for it in the moment, so it happens.
So probably yes, but
yes, but no.
Well, everyone you need. Every time you need
that's
something.
True. I mean, sometimes it's, especially if it's just like a sentence or something. Like, okay, it's not like the reader's gonna read a sentence and go, like, I'm out. That was, you know what I mean? Yeah. But if it's something huge or something significant.
Then maybe so.
No. My argument was, by this point, you are with Trey, and if Trey finds it interesting, you will find it interesting too. That if it's captivated him, it will captivate the reader. That's what I told myself.
I love it.
Well, I don't remember reading it and feeling like there was anything that didn't belong.
Yeah. But I'm sure it was a battle with the editor.
Yep.
Maybe.
Well, we have this in television all the time. You go, because I think everybody's like, well, it has to move the train forward. And yet sometimes these grace notes that don't necessarily move the train forward. I mean, the movie Doubt has this scene I always think about. This. It's not even a scene, it's a moment where Meryl Streep, who's so hard and mean in that movie, is having dinner and there's that blind nun next to her. And the nun is like reaching around for a fork. And Meryl, just without saying a word, pushes the fork in reach of her hand. You don't need that. And it's certainly like it but I love every once in a while.
Well, and I think it goes back to what we were saying before, that like, and this isn't true for all viewers or readers, but watching or reading something is also an aesthetic experience, right? And so maybe an image or a sentence is not necessary to the plot, but it's enjoyable, right? I can think of plenty of movies where it's like, I didn't even think this, but the reality is they didn't need this scene, but it was really lovely to experience in the context of this story.
Yeah.
So.
Well, the last one, and sometimes the most controversial, but maybe Kill Your Darlings was for us, but is the Oxford comma, which is random that it's so polarizing, but maybe it just depends on.
I'm a yes now. I used to not be, but now I'm a yes.
I was the nuns at St. Andrew's grade school. I mean, I was taught to use it. So I do it I don't even think about it. I wouldn't think not to. But I'm also, I get people nix it, and I don't have a strong feeling about it.
Yeah,
but
me
it
too.
Is my
and I used to not really use it, and then when I started teaching undergrads, I started saying, yeah, these are actually kind of necessary, And so, it's the same. If I'm reading something that doesn't have them, I don't care. But for me, I use them.
You have a bit of a journalism background too, though, right, Laura?
A what background?
Journalism.
I studied it a little bit. I wouldn't say I have a background, but I have written some stuff. And I think it's more just, I used to teach ESL and, teaching writing at the college level with undergrads. You're really like, the rules become just a part of your thinking about doing the work.
Gotcha.
And because you understand what they're supposed to be doing, right? You understand what the purpose of the Oxford comma. Maybe that's the issue. It's weird to be talking about the Oxford comma this much. But when you know, like, the whole point of it, right, then you say, oh, that is important. But I think that we don't talk as much about, well, why do we use the Oxford comma? What is the point of punctuation?
Yeah,
this is a weird conversation to be having. But, yeah.
Well, I also think television has made me biased towards it because oftentimes what you're writing needs to be said aloud, and for pacing and pause, like those commas matter.
Yeah.
M dashes matter. All that matters because this has to be delivered.
I am always a fan of more commas than less. I am like the writer that puts commas for pauses and not for grammatical effect. But
yeah. Well, when I teach undergrads, and especially when I first started teaching, I was teaching like developmental writing. And so these are a lot of students who just don't care or know about the purposes of all the rules of grammar. And I'm not a grammarian, and I'm not like strict, but I feel like once part of your job is to explain that to people, you start recognizing, there really is a point. It's not just that there are rules for rules' sake. It really does help the writing. It helps the flow of the writing. It helps the reader know how to engage with and interpret what they're reading.
Well, I think the Oxford comma has kept its reputation of talking about it more than you ever think you would.
It's like, really? Me? I'm just the Oxford comma. There's so much more. There are many more exciting punctuation marks, but
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for joining me. As usual, we'll put all the important links in our show notes. Make sure that you follow Rasheed and Laura and check out their books. My Government Means to Kill Me and Sweet, Soft, Plenty Rhythm are the books. We'll link to those in our bookshop storefront. So thanks so much, everybody, for listening, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to the Permission to Write podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. Plug into our community that works to cultivate and amplify the voices of Black writers and writers of color by visiting permissiontowrite.com. We'll see you next time.